to another tutorial session. In this tutorial session, we will look at animation and player mechanics as a whole. In our previous tutorial session, we looked at creating the environment and the background, as you can see. I made a slight change by changing the other layer of the ground elements to 2. So you can do that as well. This is because of clipping in some cases, whereby the ground might clip with other elements in the scene and you wouldn't want that. Let's clean up the hierarchy by creating an empty game object. We'll call it environment. And we'll select everything that makes up the environment and drag and drop it into the environment folder and save. This means that now when you deselect the environment, you deselect basically everything within the scene. Now the second thing we'll do is that all these animations will be in the description below, because these are what we'll use for the animations. Now animation is basically a number of images or motion pictures, basically a number of images which are run at a high speed frame by frame or frame by frame animation. So basically all these images which are drawn by an artist are run frame by frame, which is drawn by an artist or an animator, are run frame by frame through an animation engine or a timeline, and that creates your animation. This tutorial session will be in 2 parts, likely 2 videos which would cover animation using images, and another video which will cover animation rigging, and whereby we'll create our own animation, frame by frame animation. So without any much ado, let's get straight into it. So in our scenes, we'll drag and drop this character, and then you would realize that this character is behind the ground, which is not something we want. So we'll increase the other layer of the character to something which of quite a high value, so let's say 4. And then you would realize that now the character is placed well on the ground. Now when you play the game right now, nothing happens because nothing in the scene has physics. The character itself has no physics, it's not affected by gravity and so on and so forth. So what we are going to do is add components, and you realize physics and physics 2D. Now this is a 2D game, unlike a 3D game as we saw in our previous game. So in this one, we'll select physics 2D and select a rigid body 2D, unlike the rigid body we saw in our previous game. Now the rigid body is responsible for handling the physics of the character. Now right now when we press play, you would realize the character will fall because now the character is acting upon gravity. Now we'll want the character to be able to collide with objects within the scene. So to be able to do this, the character would need a collider as well as other objects the character would want to collide with. So basically we'll still select physics 2D and select a polygon collider. Now this polygon collider takes the shape of the character or image in question and creates a collider which matches the image. Now when we press play, the character still falls because the ground doesn't have a collider of its own which the character's collider can collide with. So in spite of this, we would select the environment game object and create an empty 3D object and call it ground. Now this ground will add a game object and this game object would add a component physics 2D and edge collider. Now the edge collider is a collider which looks more or less like a line. Now this creates a border or a collider in which other game objects with their colliders can't break this barrier or can't pass through this barrier because you'll be colliding with this particular game object. So we are going to expand the size of the line to quite so that it would fill the ground, And now you realize that when I press play, the character stands firmly on the ground. You realize that the character shakes a little, which is not something we want. So we'll select the character game object and click freeze rotation so that the character doesn't rotate. So when we press play, nothing happens and there's no shake anymore. There are other colliders which you can use within the scene. So by selecting this particular game object, we'll add components physics 2D and select a box collider. Now the box collider is box shape as its name suggests, and we can increase the size on its y-axis as well as the size on its x-axis, and we can offset this box collider such that it fits perfectly with what we want. And now we are done with setting up the scene. So let's move straight into the animation. So we are going to create two animations, the idle animation and the run animation for this character. So in the assets folder, we'll create a new folder and call it animation. Now in this animation folder, we'll click the window menu here and click animation and select animation and click animation. I've been saying animation a lot. So this animation tab, you drag and drop it here. Rather here, so that you can have more space here. So this animation is known as a timeline, or this toolbar or window pane is known as a timeline because you can see timer values in seconds here. Now we need an object we are going to animate. So we'll select this particular object and then would press create. Now we are going to create an animation. We will call this animation idle because that's the animation we want to create. Now this does something interesting because it creates another element on the object which wasn't there previously. Now this object is known as an animator. Now an animator is a state machine, or is an engine that's responsible for transitioning animations or changing the state of an animation from one state to another, like from an idle state to a running state, which I'll show in another video. So by selecting the window menu and selecting animation and selecting animator, you will now be shown the animator, and with this particular game object selected, you will now realize that there's a line from entry to idle. Now this idle is the state which was created from our animation which we just created. Now this state, basically what this means is that from game entry, the default state that this object will hold will be idle, meaning when the game starts, the object will always be in an idle state. Very good. So we are going to create this idle animation, and we'll press this red button here, which means we are recording an animation. We'll select the idle folder and we'll start placing the images one after the other. Now this particular image is the base image which we can see, and the second image you see is another image which is slightly different from the other. So per the number of images you have which runs the animation, you would place them one after the other till the animation is complete, which I'm come to do exactly that. Now you realize that this animation pane kept reducing and increasing in size. This is because of the scroll wheel, which I use to either expand how deep I want the timing between each frame. Now these are known as nodes, and these nodes are responsible for each animation which is going to occur at which time or frame. So basically when I press this, you would realize that the animation plays as you want. Now this animation is not perfect, as you can see, because animation takes time and practice to get the right timing between each animation you want to run, and you have to make sure that your animation matches the number of images you have. Yes, matches the number of animations you have. Exactly. So having these animations set up, you would realize that this particular character is the idle animation is set up. Sometimes the animations might not be precise, and basically it's a lot of configuring to be able to set up your animation properly. I think this should be fine. Yes, so I think this should be fine, and the character is in an idle state as it is. So when the game is played, you would realize that the character always keeps animating, or the idle animation keeps running. So what we are going to do is select the run object, folder, on the optimized game object. We are going to create a new clip within the animation window pane, and we want to basically save this animation within the animations folder, and we'll call this run. And in the run animation, we basically do the same thing we did in the idle. So basically when you run your animation, you should see the character animating. So what happens, or how would we be able to transition from our idle state to our run state? So how we will do that is basically by code and input, which we would run in the next particular video or in our next session. So what the animator does is that you can create a state from this. You can create a transition from this state to this state, and then the character will be able to transition from the idle state to the run state. So when you press play, basically all you can watch is the idle animation being played and nothing happening to the run state. So that's pretty much for today's video. I tried making it as short as possible. And in our next video, we'll look at transitioning between these two states. I hope you enjoyed this session, and until then, see you and bye bye.